I think we'll open up to questions from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Mohib. I'm sure there must be some questions. If you could just say your name and where you're from, that'd be great. We'll squeeze you in and we'll try and finish on time. We've got 3 minutes, so it might be 5 minutes over time. I hope that's okay for us.
You spoke about countries that are peaceful.
Can you have a mic, please, so we can hear you?
Countries that are more peaceful, we're seeing far-right groups sort of increasing. And you were saying...
Can you start again?
So far-right groups and countries that are more peaceful, you made a suggestion that that's quite a worrying progression. Why is that? What's your understanding of that?
Sure.
From a local government perspective, I'm quite interested to understand.
Sure.
Because we're seeing a growth in rallies in the city.
Sure. I mean, to take it first sort of in a global context, and then I'll try to bring it down to as you said, to a much micro level. Globally, we have seen a rise in populism. There is greater political polarization. I mean, politics were always divided. That's not the issue. The issue is that when politics are divided in a way that creates trouble in societies, and trouble in a sense that when us versus them sort of situations are created, when social cohesions in different societies are affected, that's where the issue is becoming more troubling. The reason we think it's more troubling is some of the major attacks, some of the very major attacks that, I mean, the far-right terrorism is not an easy issue to pinpoint and call it right or left-wing or any of that sort, but it's that politically motivated terrorism in high peace context is the whole issue. Maybe calling it far-right is one sort of aspect of it, and that aspect has been dominant. So that's where it is. These groups, looking at what happened in New Zealand, looking at what happened in Sri Lanka, looking at what happened in El Paso in the US, that's the concerning part. These groups are globally sort of connecting through technology more and more. They can create violence in spaces where there are opportunities, New Zealand being an example, Sri Lanka being another example. Of course, I mean, the US is one of the worst case scenarios in a sense that the lack of control on arms availability is, the biggest concern, that all the groups can exploit it, unaffiliated groups can exploit it in the shootings and all that, we know about that. So that's the sort of the worrying trend around it. Bringing it to sort of local communities and local sort of context, that sort of political polarization and the moving away from creating more socially cohesive societies where positive peace is stronger, where people respect the rights of others, people have good relations with their neighbors, and in that sense, creating more cohesive societies is the issue. And that political polarization that comes around that influences politics, then politicians try to appeal to a certain aspect of their constituencies. That is the sort of the worrying trend around that. Driven by many factors, it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint, here or there. But of course, I mean, the global changes in global peace in the last 10 years, 15 years have had an impact on it. The migration crisis in Europe, the terrorist attacks in the West has had a contribution to it. So that's, I think, I'll finish with that.
Hi, I'm Guy from Deakin University. First, I want to ask you about what is the difference from far right and left right. And I want to ask another question about positive peace. Is there any project that you do in order to, because we know that online approach used by terrorist group massively, so do you do any project on the online approach? Thanks.
I'll go first, so I've got a different voice. Not specifically. However, we do have an online Positive Peace Academy. I was going to talk about our activation points, and that's one of our activation points is a free online Positive Peace Academy that anyone can log on to and use it whether for education or for whatever purpose. Certainly, face-to-face, our most very recent project we did was with the City of Melbourne. Their concern was around the emergence of right-wing views, and that resulting in prejudice-motivated crimes, or hate crimes if you like, in the City of Melbourne. And our most recent project, Gabe is in the room here, he helped us with us, was a Positive Peace Lab working with diversity across community, bringing together community leaders from across community to think through how to improve social cohesion by using that Positive Peace framework.
On the left wing or right wing, and again, not in a specific context, in a global context, I mean, there are the two sort of spectrum of politics. The right wing being more nationalistic, more on that aspect, sort of religious and all that. The right wing, where we call it the left wing, of course, ideology becomes a little bit more of a concern, where there is far left groups that believe in a certain probably version of communism or something like that. So that's how different the data is differentiated. IEP does not do that. We do not sort of apply that judgment to the data. So the data comes from different sources that undertake sort of a very careful analysis of each incident and try and label it in a certain category. And that's what IEP takes, and based on that data, we create our analysis. So there is that, in IEP, we have, as I said, the international panel, that sort of expert panel that our results and our analysis goes through that peer review mechanism. So we take very careful approach to that to not sort of label things from our end, but rather what data says to us, and we approach it that way.
Last question.
Okay, yeah, well, thank you for a very interesting talk. And I really like the idea of a positive peace. I think that's what the world needs to strive for. One thing I don't understand is when you have the 10 countries you rated as most prone to terrorism or where it's prone, I don't understand how you rated them, frankly. A country like India being number 7, I think. I mean, it's just one above Philippines or whatever. I don't agree with that. And the reasons for terrorism flourishing in certain countries or escalating in certain countries. Have you ever looked at, like in Syria, let's say, in that part of the world? Is it a result of outside powers interfering? Until Syria was, you may not agree with its government, but it was a lot better than many other countries. But since the invasion, since it was considered, must get rid of such and such, it's gotten much worse. And the same with Iraq. I mean, there were no angels there, the dictators there. But really, do we, as an outside force, have a right to go, this regime change thing? That has resulted in a lot of terrorism. And I think the global powers need to think about that. They're not really helping world peace by doing that, making it worse. And with all due respect, I know you are the experts. I'm really a layperson. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. On the India part, I'll get to that. Again, this is not IEP's judgment on India. India has 1.35 billion population, like it's a 1,300 million, somewhere there. It experiences more than 1,000 deaths from conflict and from terrorism a year. The reason they do not attract as much attention as Afghanistan would, or Syria would, or Yemen would, or even Somalia. I mean, you know, all these countries, is because there is a whole sort of, you know, dynamics around those countries. The international politics that you rightfully mentioned that are involved, the attention from media, and hearing more about them is the issue. India is not unstable. India does not suffer day-to-day violence. Of course, when we get to the negative piece, or violence and homicides and violent crimes and, you know, all the other aspect, that's a Global Peace Index studies that. And then there's the positive peace studies that we do there. But India experiences, when you compare it relative to these other countries, a significant amount of deaths a number of deaths from terrorism and from conflicts. These are minor conflicts, and they're causing a large number of casualties. So that's one reason. The Global Terrorism Index is not an indication of instability in the country. That's not what we're trying to say here. We're trying to say this country was impacted at this level by terrorism. And India, at its size, it doesn't experience any widespread violence or mass violence, but experiences that. Back to the point on international politics, absolutely not. I mean, the international community has not been helpful in resolving conflicts. Absolutely, I agree with you. What needs to happen is that the positive peace approach, building institutions rather than destroying it, trying to help domestically grown democratic forces to become stronger over time, not overnight. This doesn't happen overnight. It has to take time. So I totally agree on that aspect. There is a very strong realization of it, of course, after a huge amount of learning, after a huge amount of failures, after a huge amount of violence and deaths and all that. But that learning has been happening. And of course, I mean, IUP has been part of that. Since 2007, we have been releasing Global Peace Index, the Positive Peace Index, and for the last 7 years, the Global Terrorism Index. We have been part of the sort of the UN consultation groups. We have been part of the many other civil society groups that have been pushing for exactly the same point that you mentioned, that the solution is in peace building, not in sort of undertaking wars.
Thank you, Mohib. And Charlie, I'm sure they're happy to continue this conversation, but we kind of weren't able to squeeze into the time at some other time. So thank you. Please join me in thanking for the conversation.